Thank you for inviting me. I welcome the opportunity to talk about these issues that are so present and critical for us now. As Bill mentioned, the Cold Case Justice Initiative continues our work in investigating unsolved racially motivated crimes during the Civil Rights era. And so in talking about voting issues today, I thought it might be helpful not only to give an overview of some of the concerns about voter suppression, but also to talk about the ways in which numerous cases arose during the Civil Rights era and how issues of voting rights and voting suppression continue in the present. But I wanted you to be familiar with cases or people's names with whom you might not have been familiar and why these issues remain present for us. But I'm going to begin first by going over some of the issues relating to voting rights. Next one, please.
Yep.
All right. So when we're talking about voter suppression, this is a working definition that I will typically use, and that is any attempt to try to stop people who are otherwise eligible to vote from being able to vote, and attempts to keep people who are ineligible who should be justly considered eligible to vote. Next one, please. And so when we talk about voter suppression, really, as I have often described it, I as well as others, that voting in the United States has more aptly been characterized by exclusion rather than inclusion. And this is something that began at the nation's founding, when, as an initial matter, only those landed classes, male landed prosperous classes, were able to vote. And then over time, many distinct groups began to advocate and protest, for the right to vote. And so you had the women's suffrage movement during the Civil War era. You had activism for the right to vote for enslaved persons and then formerly enslaved persons during the Reconstruction era. Certainly during the Vietnam era, there was activism when the 27th Amendment was passed, lowering the voting age to 18. And these efforts at voting suppression continue. And one of the main questions as it relates to voting and who gets to vote and voting rights is, what does citizenship mean without the right to vote? As some have said historically and in present day, that it really is the cornerstone of our democracy, and that the sine qua non of citizenship is the right to vote and the right to be able to express your views and your preferences as it relates to the form of government and to your representatives in that government. So voting holds a very heralded position within the democracy itself. Next one, please. So among these areas then, where we have recognized the issues and reasons for voter suppression, race, gender, poverty, age, and disability. Next one. So as far as gender is concerned, then, as you know, we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 15th Amendment. We're not very far from Seneca Falls, where so much of that activism took place, but it wasn't the only place where it took, where there was a concerted effort to advance the voting rights for women. And notable as insofar as issues of gender and race are concerned, that after passage of the 15th Amendment, one of the Reconstruction era constitutional amendments following the Civil War, there was the 13th, there was the 14th, and then there was the 15th Amendment, which conferred voting rights on formerly enslaved African American men. But that left out African American women who didn't enjoy the right to vote, that privilege, until the 19th Amendment was passed. And so there's always been, to some extent, some conflict in terms of just how inclusive or the continuing ways in which certain populations of our society were excluded in suffrage. Next one. All right. So in looking at gendered issues, some of the reasons that were advanced, very gender-based, stereotypes as to why, women should not have the right to vote. And these things were, this is an example of a banner, as I was, collecting, information about voter suppression issues. And so as far as gender was concerned, one of the, reasons for, very, deliberate campaign to keep women from voting. And these were some of the areas that were mentioned. As you can see, for the Oklahoma organization, one of the questions raised was, well, who is going to wash the dishes? And who's going to take care of the babies if women get the right to vote? And then the sign by the Georgia Association opposed to women's suffrage. And that was the name of the organization. It was the Georgia Association opposed to women's suffrage. And these signs were, posted all over the area. One, women did not want the right to vote, and that it was going to increase the expense in order to implement elections. Excuse me. Notably, again, going back to the issue of race, that one of the reasons given was that it was going to cancel out the fact that African Americans had been disenfranchised. And so in that way, there would be no net gain with respect to women and people of color. And so as we have seen in other instances as well, being pit against each other. Among the other dangers, concern about, farmers' families if Black men were able to vote, and if Black women were able to vote, concern about depreciation of farmlands under universal suffrage. And lastly, you will note, and this is probably the most candid reason of all, and that is that white supremacy has to be maintained. And so, the intersection of, gender and race here and the hierarchical nature of gender and race being represented in this reason, that ultimately it was about maintaining a racial system, a racial hierarchical system as it related to who got the right to vote. Next one, please. And so what I want to depict here is that, the stories of women's suffrage do not generally talk about Black women. And so there were organizations of Black women. There was the Black Women's Suffrage League and other organizations of Black women who also fought for the right to vote. Now, this became especially important because many of the, suffrage just movements were racially exclusive. And so Black women had to advocate for their own rights. in order to vote. So they did that by, in some instances, joining organizations, or in other instances, creating their own organizations. So whereas because of gender dynamics, Black men sometimes did not advocate for Black women's right to vote either. White women did not advocate for Black women's rights, and so they often found that they had to advocate on behalf of themselves, as much as trying to join existing organizations to enlarge those organizations to include them in voting rights advocacy as well. So it was very much a matter of suppression as it related to not including all women who might have the right to suffrage. Next one, please. All right. So as I was just saying, the images just before looked at, the disenfranchisement of Black women who formed their own groups. So there were organizations like the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, founded in 1896. And some of these groups, in fact, continue to exist, that are focusing, very much, primarily on ensuring that suffrage of women of color, Black women, other women of color are able to exercise the franchise. Again, the 19th Amendment having passed in August 1920, and so looking at the 100th anniversary of that, it's been a very mixed recognition of just what that movement was about, especially to the extent that it was not always inclusive of Black women. Some of you might be familiar that in New York City, there is a new statue that is going to be unveiled in recognition of the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. One of the complaints that has happened quite vociferously about what monuments exist throughout the country has focused on the women's suffrage movement. And so this new monument depicts, some of the, foremothers of that movement, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton, why am I forgetting her name right now, from Rochester? Beg pardon?
Susan B. Anthony.
Yes, thank you very much. Just for a moment there, my brain froze along with my screen. Yeah, so Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. But notably, this statue also includes Sojourner Truth. And there was an interesting backstory to that, because the artist originally had only Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. But then there was a complaint that that was not representative of all of the women who fought for women's suffrage. And so she revised it and included Sojourner Truth into that statue. So now there are 3 women in that statue that's going to be unveiled in New York City. Next one. All right. So we have the 15th Amendment. And, again, just thinking about the matters of, voter suppression, after the period of enslavement, when the 15th Amendment was passed in 1870, that was to remove, these vestiges of enslavement that existed prior to the Civil War. But things, certainly did not occur so smoothly. And that, after emancipation, there were many efforts, including, violent and terroristic efforts, to maintain the system of slavery, or something that was tantamount to it. So even though the 15th Amendment was passed, and it brought about quick or substantial improvements or advancements in the right to vote, it continued in a way to try to deny this right for Black men to vote. Now, what I've mentioned here is that, the passage of the 15th Amendment brought about a great number of changes politically, for African American communities. In fact, it was an era in which, notable for the significant number of Black elected officials during that time. And many of them, I guess I would say most of them, were elected from the Delta South, which was the predominant slaveholding area in the country. Next one. Now, so again, there was, hostility to this idea of Black voter rights. And so what happened in the aftermath of this political advancement was the, advent of measures that sought to deny the rights and in very dangerous and violent ways. Now, some of them, they included Black codes, which prohibited Black people from, committing any kinds of acts which were considered to be criminal in some way. Criminal if they were committed by Black people, not criminal if they were committed by white people. There were poll taxes. Now, of course, many people coming out of enslavement, did not have, financial wherewithal. I mean, they were just getting on their feet after being emancipated. And so poll taxes constituted a great impediment to the right to vote. Literacy tests were also implemented. And so there were requirements that Black voters have to pass certain tests, and there were, literacy tests. And, what is certainly interesting about that is, the literacy rate, at that particular time, in any case, was quite low for newly emancipated African Americans. But it's important to note also that for many poor white Americans, the literacy rate was also fairly low. There wasn't universal public education at this time during in the country, and so literacy was an issue across the board for many people in the country. But whites did not have to pass any of these literacy tests. They were implemented against African Americans, even where whites might have had to take the test under some, veneer that they were racially neutral. If they passed them or not, they were still able to vote. And so these were the variety of measures that were used in order to suppress the, Black vote in particular. You had limited hours for voting. Some of these things probably strike a chord as you're looking at what's going on in the country today, where certain practices are taking place that have, made it more difficult to vote. The hours for voting, the locations for voting, all of these things are taking place. One of the phenomena that restricted the right to vote was the so-called whites-only primaries. In many, jurisdictions, the primary election, I guess we could say, much of this continues today. Sometimes whoever wins the primary, is, the person who is, most likely to win the general election. And so the primary was often dispositive of who was going to be the office holder. But still, the primaries were held. And this was especially true in, various locations in Texas, where a number of lawsuits were brought against the whites-only primaries. And that meant that if you excluded Black folks from voting in the primaries, then they had no chance of having the candidate of their choice being elected in the general election. That practice was ultimately found to be unconstitutional through a variety of through a number of constitutional claims. As I mentioned, voter intimidation was rather rampant in a number of ways. Voter intimidation against those who would seek to register to vote, voter intimidation against their families, voter intimidation in the way that, if, people expressed in some way that they wanted to vote, that they would lose their jobs. If they worked independently, people would stop patronizing their businesses. If they worked for other people, they could be fired. So there are all kinds of ways in which threats were, visited upon people who sought to exercise their rights to vote, The Jim Crow laws, much like the Black codes, were applied, only against African Americans, and then very, very violently, in the most direct way, there were lynchings of people who sought to exercise the right to vote. Next one. Now, so having said this, as always, there was resistance to discrimination against, voters, people who would seek to vote, and resistance to disenfranchisement. And so during the civil rights, movement and era, there was passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And a great deal of, social foment occurred during this period. Now, the, Voting Rights Act of 1965 was enacted so that the 15th Amendment would be effectuated. And under the VRA, it had certain provisions which recognize that in some jurisdictions, particularly in the South, but not only in the South, in fact, New York had some covered areas, but the Voting Rights Act had provisions known as pre-clearance, and the pre-clearance requirement was that jurisdictions that had formerly exerted, power and ways to restrict the right of Black folks to vote, would, if they were to make any changes to their voting practices, they would have to get those changes pre-cleared or advanced approval from the Department of Justice before they were able to do those things. That is because of the kind of mischief that I was mentioning before. Suddenly changing polling places so that people wouldn't know exactly where their polling places were, or enacting or, erecting other types of barriers to people being able to vote, limiting the hours that people could vote in certain districts. And all of these kinds of things formed, various types of voter suppression. And so under the Voting Rights Act, these proved to be very effective measures so that, states and jurisdictions could not put these kind of measures in place without having to go through the Justice Department first. Next one. Now, here is the image of Jimmy Lee Jackson. I wanted to talk a little about Jimmy Lee Jackson, which has, direct relevance to the work that we do at the Cold Case Justice Initiative. As I mentioned earlier, a number of these cases where the killings were racially motivated during the Civil Rights era had to do with had to do with ordinary people, just Black folks just going about their business, but being attacked on or killed on the basis of race. But some of those, a fair number of those victims of this racist violence were people who were advocating and very active in the struggle for voting rights. And Jimmy Lee Jackson was one such person. Jimmy Lee Jackson was 27 years old when he was killed in Marion, Alabama in 1965. He was part of the movement of activists like John Lewis and others who were protesting, peacefully protesting for voting rights in Alabama. And so there were the marches, from in Selma, across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. In fact, when Jimmy Lee Jackson was killed, there was, one of the marchers, just prior to the Bloody Sunday March in March of 1965. So he was killed in February in one of the precursor marches before Bloody Sunday, and he and his, the parents had sought refuge in one of the local restaurants. And when a white Alabama state trooper came into the restaurant and sought to harass Jimmy Lee Jackson and some of the other patrons who were in the restaurant, Mr. Jackson sought to protect his parents, even as the trooper knocked her to the ground. And that resulted in a scuffle. The ultimate result of that was that the trooper shot Jimmy Lee Jackson in the abdomen, and he subsequently died from those injuries. For a very long time, it was not known exactly who was responsible for the killing of Mr. Jackson until State Trooper James Bernard Fowler, who was a former Alabama State Trooper, came forward and said that indeed it was his shot that was the fatal shot that killed Mr. Jackson. So why do we talk about this in terms of cold cases? That is because this did not happen for 45 years. It was not until 2010 that this case was solved. And that was with the former state trooper coming forward to say that he was the one who was responsible for this killing on that day. He received, he entered into a plea bargain and received perhaps one of the lightest sentences that one can receive and still call it a criminal act. And he was able to decide where he was going to serve his sentence. So it was primarily probation that he got for this killing, low-level manslaughter killing. So the fact that the case was ultimately solved, certainly came as some relief to Mr. Jackson's family. But it was greeted with some, mixed reaction because the sentence was as light as it was. And so, for some, it seemed to be a continuing injustice in this case, particularly after 45 years of waiting for justice in that case. You can see that there is a marker there noting Mr. Jackson just outside of Selma, Alabama. Next one, please. So what I also wanted to share with you is a case, someone else whose name, may be, less well known, but someone who should be remembered in terms of, the pantheon of people who have been so active as it relates to voting rights issues. And this is a man named Vernon Dahmer. Mr. Dahmer lived just outside of Hattiesburg, Mississippi. He was an independent businessman. He had a local, general store. He was a farmer. And by almost all measures, his family did, fairly well. I mean, they were fairly prosperous, economically, and working, their own businesses. In January of 1966, now mind you, this is after passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And so after the Voting Rights Act was passed, many, Black folks began to be registered to vote, even though there was still intimidation for those efforts. And so Mr. Dahmer, his name is correctly pronounced Dahmer, Vernon Dahmer, offered his grocery store as a place for voter registration. He also offered his, grocery store, as a place where the polling, as a polling place for voters. This, action enraged, the Ku Klux Klan. They threatened him and his family. He had, three sons as well as a daughter and his wife, and they were all threatened by this action to facilitate Black voter registration and a place to vote. And the Klan made good on the threats against him. So that in the early morning hours of January 10th, several, carloads full of members of the Klan surrounded his home and his business. They firebombed it. Mr. Damer held them off for what I'm sure felt like, eternity. But he was able to shoot back at those who were assaulting his family. So that his wife and daughter were able to get out of the home. Now the place was, almost completely aflame, and so Mr. Damer's daughter, Betty, suffered severe burns over much of her body. And what you see here is a poster because CCJI invited Mrs. Damer, Ellie Damer, his widow, and Betty, his daughter, came to speak to us in 2014 and talked about their experience of the violence of that evening, the violence of that era. Their families' attempts to get justice in a case. And again, it's an instance where here it took 32 years before someone was ultimately held accountable for the death of Vernon Damer. And that was one of the grand dragons of the Mississippi Klan, Sam Bowers, who was convicted in 1998 for his death. Sam Bowers did die in prison in 2006, but it was another instance of someone trying to make real the promise of voting rights for all people in the United States, irrespective of race, who faced, this ultimate wrath of those who would keep this right against people based on race. And it took decades before someone was ultimately held accountable for his death. Let me just say, so there's a picture of Mr. Damer on the left, my left, and then on the right, what you see are his two sons who had served in the military, who had returned home to find the aftermath of this bombing of his family's home. And so this is what remains. This is them going through the charred remains of his family's home. And I think it's so important to see this because, these are the costs. When we talk about courage, because Vernon Damer knew that the Klan opposed, any kind of extension of the right to vote, particularly to make it, easier for people to vote and make his, space available for as a polling place and a place for, registering voters. He worked with SNCC, in order to get people, there, to properly register to vote. And many people at this time also, had served in the military. And so they had represented their country. They had represented their country proudly. And this was the kind of violence that they continued to endure in order to be considered full-fledged citizens, in that effort to be considered full-fledged citizens. And so you can see that this is, down to the cinder block remains of their home. And so, they are continuing after, effects of the injuries that Betty Dahmer suffered. She was passed through a broken glass to get out of a burning home. And so she still has just the evidence of some of those burns on her body. But this is a harrowing account. And I think it's important for people to know that these are the kinds of forms of resistance, the kind of courage and sacrifice that people have made for this right to vote. Next one. All right. Now, I mentioned the Voting Rights Act, and so some of the sacrifices that there were. And so in recent years, the Supreme Court has scaled back on the provisions of the Voting Rights Act. This case, Shelby County versus Holder, was brought. It was decided in 2003. It was brought earlier in Alabama, claiming that the pre-clearance requirements were unconstitutional in that they treated different states differently. All states didn't have to get pre-clearance in order for them to make any changes to their voting procedures and so forth. And so they should not be treated differently either. The Supreme Court, at least a majority of the Supreme Court, agreed with that position. And Chief Justice John Roberts actually wrote the position, the opinion in that case. And one of the major premises of Chief Justice Roberts' opinion for the majority was that, times had changed and that it could no longer be justified or rationalized that different states ought to be treated differently, that the South was, no longer the same as it related to, the racial discrimination. Chief Justice Roberts, for instance, pointed to the fact that Barack Obama had been elected, president of the United States as evidence of proof that, racism in any of its forms continued to exist, such that it justified continued oversight by the Department of Justice. And as you can see here in the third bullet point, that the pre-clearance requirement applied to 9 states as well as several other municipalities. Once again, it wasn't just the South, it was primarily the South. But you can see that there were places in Brooklyn and Manhattan and the Bronx to which the Voting Rights Act also applied. So the Voting Rights Act itself has not been declared unconstitutional, but significant portions of it, and some would say, and I would agree, its most effective portions of the act have been eviscerated to some degree. And so there are measures that are being considered now which would restore the effectiveness of the Voting Rights Act. Could I have the next slide, please? So looking at the fact that voter suppression continues to exist in the present day, here are some of the ways in which it occurs now, as it did in previous eras. So you have less accessible polling places. You now have proof of citizenship requirements. If you remember, the 13th Amendment conferred citizenship, on formerly enslaved persons. And so now you have something that sort of harkens back to that era where citizenship, once again becomes an issue as it relates to voting rights. So you have, voter ID requirements in 36 states. North Carolina is currently under an injunction, not to implement their voter ID requirements. You have gerrymandering issues. All of these measures. The summary, closing of a number of polling places. and the disenfranchisement of former felons from voting. Now, this is a very hotly contested issue because, as you may be aware, in Florida, Florida passed a law that would allow formerly incarcerated, felons who had completed their sentences to now be able to restore their voting rights. Well, there was a nice twist to that because the move was heralded in that it would allow people to be able to vote. But then they required that if people had any sort of outstanding fines, that they would have to pay those fines before they were able to exercise their right to vote. Now, you might imagine that, that formed something of a death knell for people because, folks didn't, first of all, a lot of people didn't know that they had any outstanding fines that they would have to pay. And then for those who did know or who found out, it was prohibitive, for them to be able to pay these amounts. So that matter was in court. The measure was upheld. And so then there was an effort to be able to, for people to collect money and help these former felons, pay whatever fines they had in order to be able to vote. But just to indicate what kind of mischief was involved in this, in a number of the cases, the jurisdictions weren't even aware themselves that there were outstanding fines. And so just as an administrative or bureaucratic matter, it was hard to even find out just what, the prospective voter needed to do in order to vote. And so it just shows like one more type of impediment to people's right to vote. Could I have the next one, please? All right. And I think this is the final slide. And that is, just to show, just the significance. I mean, we are on the eve of a major election, and we are seeing that there are a number of contested and, conflicting issues as it relates to the right to vote for many people. Language issues, accessibility issues, polling place issues. You all have seen the news, I'm sure, where some of these lines are wrapping around, buildings for people to be able to vote. Now, that is not all COVID related. Some of that has to do with changes to the polling places, people suddenly finding out that, their polling places have been moved from one place to another. So there's a lot going on with respect to, what is underfoot, with respect to people's right to vote. But what we are seeing, and one of the things I would say that I find heartening, is that people are withstanding the pressures, and they are, in fact, standing in line. I saw in Georgia the other day, you might remember the primaries in Georgia where people were just, around the block, 2 or 3 times and waiting hours on end to vote. In the early voting for the general election, people were in the rain. People were in the rain waiting to vote in these long lines. In places where it's particularly hot, people are waiting in the heat. I mean, they are taking some protective measures. They are socially distancing, many folks. I am seeing people who are wearing masks, but they are waiting in line and they are determined to cast their vote. And so I think that there is something to be learned from that, that if this right means anything, that people will endure great hardship and sacrifice, because that's just how important it is to be able to cast a vote as someone who is eligible to do so as an expression and a right that is the cornerstone of this democracy. I think that's the last one, isn't it, Bill? Okay. Oh, no, that's right. I forgot. I did add this because I mentioned that there is legislation in Congress currently, the John Lewis Voting Rights Bill. The House has passed this. The Senate has not taken it up, so it's certainly not likely that it's going to happen before this election. But these are some of the measures that have been advanced in order to restore some of the issues that I had mentioned that had been rescinded as a result of the Shelby County case. So it would restore the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to full strength and take other measures that would enable and facilitate people to be able to vote. Advance notice for any kind of changes to voting procedures or eligibility, the right to send federal observers to places where there might be, concern about voter discrimination or any kind of harassment against voters. And there are other measures that are, currently, being advanced that would allow for same-day voting. So registration is a major issue as well.